It's actually my turn to introduce speakers for a change, and it's an absolute pleasure for me to introduce our next speakers, as not only are they experts in the field, but they've been great colleagues of mine for many years, and certainly two individuals that have played a part in my own professional development. So thank you both. Dr. Fieke Rongen is a senior lecturer in sport coaching at Leeds Beckett University, and her principal research interest is around investigating youth athlete development. Dr. Ian Cowburn is also a senior lecturer in sport coaching at Leeds Beckett, and with his research interest in the psychological development of youth through sport, parental involvement in sport, and also coach effectiveness and development. So it's my pleasure again presenting healthy psychosocial development of elite youth athletes, Dr. Fieke Rongen and Dr. Ian Cowburn. Hi, everyone.
Hopefully I will be with you in a minute. There we go. Has that worked, Gary? Just checking.
It certainly has.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thanks very much for your kind introductions. And as you said, this will be a joint presentation between me and Ian. Ian, do you want to just say hello?
Everyone, good evening.
And the title of the presentation was, oh, it seems to be automatically going. Sorry, Gary. There we go. We go back. The title of the presentation was Healthy Psychosocial Development of Elite Youth Athletes. Now, why are we actually talking about this topic? It's because talent development is often perceived as risky. I was just looking in the chat and I saw quite a few comments around this idea of maybe athletes being seen as commodities and perhaps not putting their experience first. Now, where does that come from, that idea of talent development as risky? Well, it comes from the idea that we're dealing with young people, and young people are going through a series of psychosocial developmental stages, and they face a number of challenges as they're growing up. In particular, the types of athletes we deal with when we're thinking about talented athletes often are developing a sense of independence from their parents, developing their own identity, seeking out a future career, and establishing a stable kind of self-image. But we also have typical talent development system features, and they're often described as maybe quite restrictive, quite adult-focused, quite scrutinizing, performance-driven, and perhaps requesting or demanding quite a lot of sacrifice from those young people. And as a result, we think that that might put young people at risk, in particular for burnout, for not developing a very well-rounded identity, for perhaps sacking off their education, or just generally compromising their well-being. But me and Ian also want to make the case, and thankfully someone else already made this for me earlier in the conference, that we could take an alternative perspective, that actually talent development environments maybe aren't that different to grassroots youth sport participation, that they offer many of the same opportunities for really meaningful social interaction, for the development of useful psychosocial and interpersonal skills, and that they can be almost like a training ground for life. Like Kev said, actually, we might even argue that because of the fact that we're moving to a higher quality environment with perhaps more intensive engagement and therefore maybe more opportunities for some of those benefits, with highly qualified coaches, really good facilities and lots of resources for support, that actually this kind of environment would offer almost youth sport plus, right? Something with added benefits. And actually those two lines of reasoning that I've just outlined are what you probably typically would see in the literature. On the one side, we've got people who we would describe as sports cynics, people who tend to go elite sport is wholly bad and there's not much good about it or in it for young people. And on the other side, we might have sport evangelists, and they often sit maybe more in the participation sport domain, where we believe that sport can do a whole lot of good. But like Kev already highlighted in his opening session, earlier session, that when we look at that literature and when we review both bodies of literature, so the grassroots literature and then the literature associated with more intensive sport participation, we can see that there's actually a potential for a wide range of positive and negative physical and psychosocial impacts that fall out of this kind of engagement. Now, me and Ian are arguing that we probably therefore need to start studying this actually, because the previous literature is cherry picking from bits of research that are out there. And they often focus on only one aspect, on only one risk or only one benefit, but they don't tend to focus on elite youth sport context or talent development context, and they tend to not measure all of those things together. So we're going to talk you through the results from 2 case studies. One of the case studies is a study that I conducted with a Category 1 elite youth soccer academy in the UK, very much focused on producing the next top players for the Premier League, but with an ethos that was also about providing really worthwhile experiences and developing the players holistically. What we did was we followed a group of under 12s to under 16s over the course of a year. And we measured a number of well-being and psychosocial development indicators, as well as their grades. Sorry, I have no idea why it's doing that. As well as their grades. We interviewed them about their experiences, and we also interviewed a number of players that were part of that environment between 1 and 10 years ago. Ian.
Yeah, and the second case study that I'll talk to you about is that of an intensive wrestling camp in the United States of America aimed at high school wrestlers. So we're looking at kind of ages 14 to 18. And whilst most of the kids that sign up to that camp would say they're going to develop wrestling skills, the camp director was pretty clear in discussions with us that one of his primary focuses really is development of mental skills and life skills to help them function as better individuals in school and the rest of their life as well. And so over that 2-week camp, we did questionnaires at the beginning and the end, and at 6-month follow-up with a larger sample with over half of the participants at camp. And then we had a smaller sample of approximately 10 that we interviewed and observed for the duration of the camp as well. Fieke.
Okay, so if we go back to the findings from the Soccer Academy study, that makes very clear to us that, and I have to kind of say at the start, that the dominant findings from this place were pretty positive around the psychosocial health and well-being and development of the young players. But it also is nuanced. If we initially go to the concern of those players perhaps being overly burdened by the environment, we showed that actually over the course of the year, their levels of stress were not very high and reduced, and their levels of recovery were pretty good and actually increased over time. So their rest recovery balance was pretty good. Equally, when we asked them about their psychological well-being over the course of the year, they reported that to be stable, positive, and completely within the European norms for children of their age. We also asked them about their basic psychological needs, so that they feel they had any kind of autonomy, that they feel related, and that they feel that they had a sense of competence. And actually, those needs were often satisfied and stable across the year, and rarely dissatisfied, and that was stable across the year. But when we then look at the qualitative data, we can see that some of those players, or actually most of those players, did perceive a sense of pressure. Many of them described this feeling of always being watched, always being assessed, always having to live up to particular expectations. But what those players highlighted was that some of them thrived under that pressure, whereas others perhaps struggled more. And that shows us that maybe the experience of players and the impact on players is not universal, but it's quite individual. Then the data also showed us that impact is not stable and it's emerging. So if we think about the kind of psychosocial skills that players thought they developed, most of them said, I learned lots of stuff on the pitch, but actually, maybe I actually even learned more off the pitch. I learned about work ethic, I learned about dedication, I learned about my time management, I learned about being independent, I learned about managing myself. And what players admitted is that those kind of skills often, they kind of realized they had them when they became useful in other contexts, so like school or when they went to university. When we then look at education and our concern that those kind of players are perhaps prioritizing sport too much, they filled in the athletic identity measurement scale, and it showed that they have a very strong and pretty exclusive athletic identity, much higher than their peers, their age group peers. But at the same time, whilst it is a risk factor for things like sacking off education, their grades didn't show any negative impact compared to, again, other age group peers that weren't in the academy. But qualitatively, the players did admit that they probably were quite tempted to put all their eggs in one basket, not to listen to coaches and kind of let those messages about needing a backup plan initially fall on deaf ears. But when we then look at the accounts of players that were in the academy 1 to 10 years ago, retrospectively, they all said it hadn't had a negative impact on their education, and actually had it opened doors for them that maybe would have stayed closed otherwise. So for example, they would have got scholarships in the UK or abroad, or they would have developed an attitude and a set of skills that allowed them to go to university, which was probably something they never really aspired to do in the first place.
All right, thank you, Fieke. So if we take a look at the intensive wrestling camp, it's probably unsurprising, given that, you know, the main focus was on developing mental skills and life skills, that we saw some positive outcomes in terms of psychological skills and characteristics. And that was shown both in the larger sample, large group quantitative data, but also in the smaller group qualitative data as well. And I'm not going to talk you through a big list on the screen for both, but just, you know, in terms of the qualitative group data, some of the themes that were coming out were enhanced confidence, work ethic, which included being able to work harder, being able to stay disciplined when working on not just wrestling, but also on, you know, particularly after the camp, on things like school, personal empowerment. So being able to take responsibility and accountability for actions, enhanced thought processes around understanding of self and reflective ability, and also some interpersonal skills as well, such as leadership and to some extent altruism in some of the participants as well. Can I have the next slide, please, Fieke? But there were some individual differences that emerged, even in that smaller qualitative sample. And depending on some of the psychological antecedents that the wrestlers had arriving to camp, meant they were better able to take advantage of that wrestling camp environment. Now, I'm not going to talk you through that you know, wrestling camp environment model in the beginning because, you know, length of the presentation, but when arriving, we kind of judged each one of the wrestlers based on their readiness for the camp. So that's their psychological and physical readiness to take on something quite so intensive, their openness to learning, and their reflective ability. And depending on how much of this readiness, openness, and reflectiveness that they had arriving changed or allowed them to take advantage of that wrestling camp environment. So the individual at the top, if you read the quote, you can see is quite a reflective individual, and that's how he was when he arrived. And that meant if we look at some of the qualitative themes towards the end, he was able to articulate those more clearly and how he was applying them maybe outside of wrestling and into some other aspects of his life. Whereas the athlete at the bottom, who was pretty closed off to learning and less reflective, got a little bit less out of the camp. Next slide, please, Fieke. So if we start to some of our research and think about how we can tip the balance in our favor in terms of whether talent development environments not being inherently good or bad, but making sure that we make the best of them. We're going to share over the next couple of the slides some things that we might want to think about in order to take advantage and use them in positive ways. So the first for me is kind of an understanding and commitment by coaches and organizations, clubs, that actually their talent development environments are possibly an ideal, and I would say an ideal opportunity to help young people meet the developmental demands that Fieke outlined at the start of the presentation. And kind of alongside that, we need to make sure that we're doing that in a developmentally appropriate way. The want and the need to learn from us because of who we are and the things that we offer, those doors that we might open, means that, you know, there's an opportunity, but there's also a challenge. We may need to make sure we're doing it in a way which is supportive of them. So here I'm going to suggest, you know, what a participant needs based on literature and what we understand about their development, but also their individual needs. there were differences in those two participants on the last slide that I talked about, and how can we help them help meet them where they are, and also what your talent development environment demands of them. If there are certain things that are going to be demanded of them, then we should probably focus on helping develop those skills first so that they can thrive in the environment rather than being diminished by it. Next slide, please, Fieke. And part of doing that then, or the next thing I'm going to suggest, is being intentional. And when I say being intentional, I mean taking ownership of the fact that we want to make our talent development environments a positive place and actually develop people in a healthy way. So I've kind of given some examples here of some things that we can do, from environment curation, which is maybe slightly more time efficient for us as coaches, because I know that we're all very busy, down to deliberately designed activities, which might take a little bit more confidence, competence, and time to do. So in terms of environment curation, it's not just the stuff we do on the mat in wrestling or in the pool or on the pitch and those kinds of things. It's all of the experiences that we put together. And we need to think about how we can use those to, one, help develop the skills, but two, create an environment that people feel safe and want to come to. And part of that is us as coaches ensuring that what we do aligns to what we say is important. So if we're going to say that time management is important and design an environment in that way, we must also be on time. I think we can better leverage naturally occurring events. We're going to have poor officiating when we're coaching. We're going to have wins and losses. We're going to have a teenager that can't self-regulate in the way that we want them to. Instead of reacting emotionally to that, if we've planned for how we want to use those moments to help them learn, I think we're being more intentional, and that will help as well. And then again, we can deliberately design activities depending on what we think is necessary, but that should run alongside our technical and tactical practices. Underpinning those three things, though, we need to, if we want it to be a life skill, discuss how it applies outside of sport and discuss that transfer. Provide opportunities for practice, because we know it's not going to happen overnight, as with any skill. And going back to those individual differences, really understand that they exist and how we might adapt what we want to do for the individuals that we have in front of us. Okay.
Thanks, Ian. And I think finally, and this again relates to what we've already heard previously in the conference, is that out of our findings, it also became clear that it's not programs doing anything, it's the people who work within those programs that actually produce particular outcomes. So all of that probably is underpinned by staff that is able to build caring, trusting, respectful relationships with their participants, who are able to create a warm, safe, and homely environment, where it's people first, performers second, who have the interpersonal skills, but perhaps more importantly, the resources, the time and the energy to have some of those conversations in the corridors, on the phone, in the weekend, over text, whatever it is, do that off-field bit of caring. And particularly people who are self-aware enough to realize that those players see them as role models, and that therefore they need to be acting in line with those values that the club, the organization has subscribed to. So to conclude, we don't think talent development and its environments are good or bad. They can be both. We believe that impact is not something that's simply understood. It's not stable, it's not universal, and it really does require more integrated and more nuanced understanding. But we do believe it's within your control as practitioners, as coaches, as organizations, to tip the scale towards the positive. And if we're accepting these environments are here to stay, and there will be selective environments, then perhaps we should focus on making the best out of them for all of the participants, not for the very few that make it. That requires attention for what your context is aiming to achieve, how best to align your practice to this, to plan for it deliberately, and is very much driven by recruiting probably the right people to do that job. Thank you very much for listening to us. I am so sorry for our presentation automatically running away from us, and any questions are very welcome.
Also, thank you very much, and thanks to Fieke for taking over the presentation, so it wasn't me who had to keep pushing it back a slide.
Thank you very much, Fieke and Ian. Not only entertaining as you worked your way through the slides running away, but also incredibly insightful. We really appreciate that. We have a couple of questions and time for a couple too. So first of all, a question from Desiree, who's asked, did the decision-making processes that players went through differ between the two contexts, wrestling and soccer?
Well, sorry, Gary, that's Desiree, that's a brilliant question. I think maybe we needed to be clear that those projects were probably done quite separately from each other, and the data was probably collected with different perhaps objectives in mind. What does she mean with the decision-making process? And if she wants to put that in the chat, I'm more than happy to answer that in the Q&A in a bit.
And once, if we get a little bit more clarification around that, might actually be a good point for Fieke and I to sit down and actually look at that and compare. So it is a good question.
Great. So I'll advise then for Desiree to just type a clarification in the chat or in the Q&A section, and Fieke and Ian will deal with that following the presentation. Ian, you spoke about a readiness for learning. How do we help young people and young athletes develop a greater readiness for learning or engagement? Because you said that those that were most ready kind of hit the ground running, but there were others who weren't.
Yeah, I think with that particular environment, there's a couple of things there. I mean, one was just the physical readiness. So, you know, they were broadly sleeping, you know, they were given 8 hours for sleep a night, but they were probably exercising 7 hours during the day. So there was just a physical component to being ready to be at that camp. Because if you weren't fit enough, you were really going to struggle with, well, just keeping up. But in terms of maybe some of that psychological readiness, I think that's a really difficult one. I'm not sure in terms of us as coaches, we can prepare people before they get to us. I think it's probably when I'm highlighting the individual differences, it's about us understanding where they're at when they get to us, and then how we develop them from there. And then once they're in your talent development environment, there's probably some cut points, you know, where they're moving up to a senior team or something else, and that's where your broader psychosocial curriculum for where you'd like them to be, so that they're going to be able to perform at that next level. You know, you're trying to develop them over the course of that by engaging in some of the activities that I outlined. I mean, there's lots of others, but as an example.
Yeah, can I add one thing to that, Gary? I think equally with the footballers or the soccer players, for whatever country we are referring to them, they definitely showed that there is other contexts in which they learn those skills. And sometimes I think as sport research, we can be a little bit guilty assuming that sport does it all and forget that they have parents and schools and teachers and other role models in their lives. And actually, some of the players that would arrive at the academy the kind of things that the academy would find important would be reinforced in other contexts and probably would stick more. Whereas for others, some of those contexts weren't perhaps as much in line or as supportive, and that would make it a little bit harder. So we probably also have a job to do in terms of working with the other stakeholders to make sure that we kind of optimize those messages.
Excellent. Thanks again, both. I know that there is 4, 5, or even 6 questions in the Q&A box. If you'd be so kind as to address some of those, as well as the clarification from Desiree. Thanks again for your really valuable insights in order to support our endeavours to get better at facilitating the healthy psychosocial development of young athletes. Thank you.